So thank you very much today for coming along to the Australian Land Conservation Alliance's a session called Environmental Policy 101. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet today and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. My name is Michael Cornish. I'm the policy lead with the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, the peak body for private land conservation in Australia. And we're going to do a bit of a whirlwind tour of all things policy, environmental policy, today. A bit of an intro. I know that there's a number of you out there who are quite acquainted with policy already. You might hear things you already know, but that's okay. But there are also plenty of people out there who, environmental policy or policy more broadly is, I guess, a very new topic or something that happens in your workplace that you might not be the one taking the lead on. And so hopefully this session will give you an opportunity to have a bit of a primer on policy and thinking about policy. And we'll also do a bit of a tour of all the, I guess, some of the major issues for policy that are facing the environment in Australia at the moment. So what we're going to go through is, well, first of all, just talk about the purpose of the session, do a quick introduction to the Australian Land Conservation Alliance for those of you who are not familiar with us. What is policy? How do we think about policy? What are the key, as I say, environmental policy challenges facing both the federal government at the moment, but also across each of the states and territories? Very brief introduction to advocacy, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. So there is a Q&A function. Do please, as we go along, put your questions into that chat. Once we finish the session, we'll jump into some Q&A. I won't pause as we go along, just because it'll break up the flow a bit too much, but we'll park all the questions until the end. So what then is the purpose of the session? Well, broadly speaking, we're trying to, here at ALCA, build the policy competence and capacity of the land conservation sector. We're also, so that, there are more people who, I guess, can contribute positively to the debates on policy and to, I guess, also the advocacy for good policy. We're going to do a bit of a snapshot of Australia's major environmental policy challenges, but there'll be a focus on land conservation. So we know that the word environment encompasses a lot more things than just land conservation, but we are the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. And so, we could be spending, I guess, a huge amount of time if we try to talk about, waste and pollution and marine and so on as well. So I'm just restricting it to land conservation today. There's going to be a bit of a primer around how, you can think about policy, or at least a couple of different frameworks of thinking about policy, because there's lots and lots of those. And then, as I say, we'll talk a little bit about advocacy as well. And the reason for talking about advocacy is policy is only good policy if it is also good politics. It's a theme that we'll come back to time and time again in this session. And then very lastly, just a little bit on, well, who am I? So as I said, I'm Michael Cornish. I head up the policy and advocacy work for the Australian Land Conservation Alliance. And my background, I guess, is, yes, economics and law and a number of other things. But most pertinently, I guess, to this, I've worked for ALCA for just over 3 years or so now. And prior to that, worked for about 4.5, 5 years as the senior policy advisor to an independent federal crossbencher. So I know Parliament, federal Parliament very well. I know federal politics very well. And thankfully, policy does make it into that place from time to time. So that's just a little bit of background on me. So an introduction on ALCA. So we're established in 2011. We've gone from strength to strength since then, but certainly in the last 3 to 4 years, since I've been acquainted with the organisation, we've gone from, I guess, having a CEO flying solo to having now a team that is, in the order of 8, 9 or 10. And, we're a member-based organisation. We have 19 members at the moment, but that number seems to be growing, year on year. And we influence almost 10% of Australia's total land area between us. As you can see there from the stats, more than 4,000 landholders, work with our member organisations. We've got more than 70,000 supporters across all those organisations. And we've got a serious annual turnover of, creeping up towards $400 million a year, and a huge number of staff. But this is probably the best slide for showing who we are, because these are the member organizations which we represent. And as you can see, there's a range of different sizes and capacities, some really well-known names, I guess, in there. But this is who ALCA is really seeking to represent, as well as the private sector, the private land conservation sector more broadly. So, we do have a view to be doing good work for land conservation writ large, as well as directly representing our members. All right, so jumping straight into the topic for today. Well, what is policy? Well, at the start of these sorts of presentations, often you'll get like, oh, well, the Oxford definition, blah, 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 is. Look, I haven't quite gone down exactly that approach, but I have looked back into the etymology of policy, and so those of you who know your ancient Greek history, poly comes from polis. It's a community of citizens. So that when you've got this prefix poly, it's relating to a community of citizens. And policy is that which emanates from a community of citizens. So, and there's a more modern meaning, I guess, which, from French, where it talks about, about this being about the civil administration. And then, interestingly, politics, of course, is the affairs of a community of citizens. So they're very, very interrelated here. Now, in reality, of course, we know that trying to pin down the exact meaning of what policy is like pinning jelly to the wall. It does mean different things to different people, but broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say that policy is really a solution to a community problem. And then, of course, there's a follow-up question. Well, what is effective policy? It's one thing to have a solution, but is it a good solution? Well, I would say effective policy is, yes, a good solution to a community problem that has a reasonable chance of being implemented, and ideally, of course, implemented well. Now, that immediately begs the question, what is good? And that really comes down to value frameworks. Some of them may be common to, all or most Australians, but some may be specific to particular interest groups. So, when we're in environmental advocacy, we naturally end up adopting quite a pro-environment frame, generally speaking, around, we seek to, I guess, elevate the value and the public value in particular of the environment. But the reason that I say here that it needs to have a reasonable chance of being implemented is because policy, again, is only good policy if it's also good politics. It's not going to be a good policy if it never has a chance of being adopted. It's not going to be good policy if it's not something that can actually be implemented reasonably well in practice. So, policy and politics really are deeply interrelated. And I've gone and created a little fancy diagram here, one of these wonderful Venn diagrams, and this is just my view. There are plenty of different ways, as I say, of thinking about what is policy and what's good policy and effective policy. But really, I think my view is that it has to combine these three elements. It has to have a practical solution. So it actually needs to work, in that sense. It needs to have a political solution. So it needs to be something that is politically attainable, politically palatable, something that as a political decision maker, that you're going to be able to back in. You're not going to get deep opposition, whether it's from various interest groups, whether it's from other members of your cabinet, for example, if you're a minister or a parliamentarian. And also, though, there needs to be effective advocacy, because often we have really good practical solutions, which are really good political solutions, but no one happens to know about them. So the advocacy piece is also really critical here to actually, try to make sure that these good solutions are socialized with those who need to know about them. All right. So that was just a very brief intro into thinking, just some thinking about, how do we think about policy? But now just doing a bit of a tour de force around Australia, around what are the major environmental policy challenges. Now, there are so many different ways we could split or categorize up the different challenges that Australia is facing. These are just, I guess, three rubrics, three ways of thinking about how we could split up thinking about the different challenges. So one is just a really simplistic one here around, well, really doesn't it just come down to laws and funding, right? We need good laws, and then we need, funding for programs that are going to do good things. Well, sure, it's one way of thinking about it. Another way is you might have heard that there's protection and management and restoration of nature. The conservation can mean those three different elements. And then there's another element there, of course, around, I guess, stopping, not just protecting, but also, actively trying to, prevent the harm from occurring in the first place, rather than just protecting after the fact. So here, when I say stopping harm, I'm talking about, for example, harmful subsidies. Where we, in Australia, we subsidise a lot of the fossil fuel use, in agricultural use and, and diesel use and so on. That might be one example where, maybe there's some thinking around how we can stop those harmful activities that damage the environment. Restoration, for those who aren't aware, this really relates to, the revegetation or, other ways of trying to restore ecosystems and biodiversity. And the management piece, the reason, you could split this out, of course, but the management piece really is talking about, well, how do you do the ongoing management of biodiversity and ecosystems? And the reason I guess I broadly categorized it into that protection and stopping harm piece is that often this relates to things like, management of invasive species, things that I guess need to be constantly addressed in order to continue to protect biodiversity and ecosystems. And then yet another rubric to, a framework for thinking about the environmental policy challenges is to adopt the international and then the national approach that relates to that international approach. So many of you may have heard of the Global Biodiversity Framework. This is an agreement that sits underneath the United Nations Convention for Biological Diversity. So the premier international convention that relates to nature and biodiversity. And there's a series of targets that sit under there. And Australia's strategy for nature is then our national attempt at trying to deliver on the targets and aims and objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And that then splits it out in a series of priorities and so on. Anyway, that's another way that we could be trying to categorize, well, what are the major challenges? Where do they fit within those frameworks? But let's now move on to look at, well, what are those major policy challenges? Now, one, I guess, a piece of information that may be useful to you in the first instance is, well, how do we know when something is a federal challenge or a state challenge or a territory challenge? Well, at law at least, so just at law at least, the reason the federal government has any role in the environment at all is really predominantly through the external affairs power within our constitution. Without that external affairs power, there's actually very limited scope for the Commonwealth government to be directly involved in the environment. So the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and that includes the Global Biodiversity Framework that I mentioned before, that is the premier convention. There are plenty of others. I mean, I've mentioned the Climate Change Convention there, of course, it's another obvious one, but there are plenty of other treaties and international conventions that Australia signed on to, and that then gives the federal government power to pursue the objectives of those international treaties. It's worth mentioning while we're here, it's not just about law, but the federal government, as we know, is usually the one that has more money available to you actually spend. And so, and this happens across a lot of different policy portfolios in government where they don't have a direct constitutional role, or at least not a complete legislative role, but nonetheless, they do have the money. And so education is another good example where they don't have a clear constitutional role in education. But at the end of the day, they're the ones with the money. There's a tendency from states and territories, and for that matter, the rest of us out there that really want to do good things in this space, to talk with the federal government about the challenges in the hope that they will see the benefit of spending some money on it. So then states and territories, they have what's called the residual power over environmental matters. So they're actually primarily responsible for dealing with the environment. The reason I say they're usually for territories, technically the Commonwealth can override their territories' laws. Hasn't happened in the environmental space as far as I'm aware, but it's always technically possible. All right, moving on. So let's start, I guess, with what is the dominant legislative challenge? We don't have time to cover absolutely everything, but we do have to cover what's called the EPBC Act. So the EPBC Act is the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, hope I'm getting the exact exact title right, because I struggle to remember whether it's environmental or environment. But nonetheless, this is the cornerstone environment legislation at the Commonwealth government level. Now, this was implemented, more than a decade or so ago, and there are independent reviews of the Act every 10 years. And we've just, well, I say just, in 2021, not just 4 years ago, we had our second independent review. So that tells you it's been around for at least 20 years. And this review is called the Samuel Review, named after the professor who led up the review, Professor Graham Samuel. And he found that essentially that our Commonwealth laws are not effective, right? And that the natural environment in Australia is in an overall state of decline and under increasing threat. So, long story short, the federal laws are not fit for purpose, according to this review. And not just not fit for purpose for the environment, but also Samuel found that it was not fit for purpose for business either. So, what were his key recommendations? Well, the centerpiece of his recommended reforms are national environmental standards. And this is to say that decisions made under this cornerstone environmental legislation needed to be made consistent with these various standards, and that the standards relate to all sorts of different, different elements of, of environmental decision making. I should mention that for those of you who are like, well, what does this Act even do? The primary purpose of the Act, it does a number of things, but the primary purpose of the Act is to look at development proposals across the country and to work out where it is that the Commonwealth government needs to step in and say, well, hang on, you're making a decision that will affect an issue that we think is of national environmental significance. And so we will then step in to say, well, you can't develop there, or maybe you can, but you can you can go and restore some habitat somewhere else, or what have you. So the primary, I guess, role of this legislation is really to govern, economic developments that that invigorate a national concern for the environment. So, okay, what has the current government done then in response to this? So they came out ultimately with something called the Nature Positive Plan. That was their response to this independent review. We should note that this response was delayed quite considerably. The previous, so the coalition government that was in before could have responded, but didn't didn't before there was an election. And so, the Labor government in their previous term, they responded to it. And they had three principles. They said, well, we're going to pursue reform of the legislation that should deliver on better protection, and by protection they mean the National Reserve System and protected areas for conservation. So the sort of the 30 by 30 national commitment that the Labor government has made, and also to prevent extinctions. They wanted to have faster decision making and more certainty for business. I guess not just for business, but for the environment sector as well. And they were going to deliver on an independent environment protection agency that would help build trust and accountability. The idea that if there was an independent organ of the government that made decisions in this space, then that would help build trust within the broader community. And the Labor election platform has, for at least the last two elections, has had a focus on an independent environmental protection agency, and also something called Environment Information Australia, which is about trying to provide better data and more transparent data on environmental matters, so that people who want to develop a particular area, they can access that common data more easily. I won't go into the politics of it because we've got to do a bit of a whirlwind, as it were. But there's a lot of politics, for those of you following this issue at the moment, and we can always talk about that in the Q&A if people want to. All right, now moving across to the funding side. So, for those of you who've attended any of my budget briefings in the past, this slide is taken from that. It uses the State of Environment Reports framework for trying to do an estimate of what I call the biodiversity spend, because there's a lot of things that could be counted as spending on the environment. For example, support for farmers on drought matters. I mean, some of that spending, for example, could be categorized as for the environment. But really, this is squarely focused on the nature spend, the biodiversity spend. So I won't stay on this for too long, other than to note that, it is less than 0.1% of the federal budget. So very little money is spent federally on the environment. And in fact, um, the budget's only 2% larger now than it was 10 years ago, and that's in real terms. So the proportion of the federal budget in total as a percentage has actually been going down over time. So yes, we're spending more money on it, and you go, well, how's that possible? Well, Australia's a richer place than it was, 10 years ago. So we are spending more real money on it, but a smaller proportion of the federal budget. And as a bit of a comparison, the tax breaks and subsidies for fossil fuels alone are worth well over 20 times the biodiversity spend. There's a great report that came out through the Biodiversity Council that interrogates, these nature negative subsidies in more detail. All right. So there's a lot of funding challenges, I guess, and policy challenges, but let's just focus on perhaps the top two or three. So one critical funding challenge is delivering on the protection side of land conservation. And so 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of Australia's lands and seas by 2030, is, I guess, the driving impetus for the current government. It comes from the Global Biodiversity Framework. So there's an international commitment, but the Australian government has also signed up to a domestic commitment to deliver this in Australia. It's not just a quantity issue, though. It's also about a quality. It's not just about saying, all right, where do we find the bits of land that no one wants and doesn't have a lot of biodiversity and protect them? It's about going, right, we need a comprehensive, adequate, representative national reserve system, so system of protected areas for conservation across the country. So that means picking up the different areas in Australia and trying to give at least a modicum of protection for all the major ecosystem types and bioregions. The Australian government has, and as a result of some great advocacy that ARCA and a number of our partners have been working on, they have committed to a $250 million program over 5 years called the Saving Australia's Bushland Program. It's not going to be sufficient to get us over the line for both quantity and quality of this protection. And there's some real composition challenges around that funding. How much is going to be for, helping to acquire the land from their existing owners and then protecting it? How much is going to be delivered through other mechanisms, such as, for example, the nature repair market? Other federal funding challenges. So threatened species. It's not a challenge per se at the moment, although obviously you speak to anyone who's an ecologist, and I'm not. It's certainly not sufficient, and certainly not sufficient to deliver on the government's objective of no new extinctions. But there is an existing program, but the program ends in this forthcoming budget year, so it'll be ending next year. So certainly an advocacy opportunity is to push for the continuation of that program, and ideally, of course, a scaling up. But we really do need to have some dedicated threatened species funding. Another one is around invasive species management. So invasive species management really is done in a piecemeal manner, across Australia. Yes, there's a lot of work that's done through the agricultural budget, but that focuses predominantly on agricultural threats, threats to agriculture that are invasive species, not necessarily the threats that are the most danger, of most concern to the environment writ large. Having said that, there is some dedicated funding to H5N1, the bird flu that's gone around the world but hasn't come to Australia yet. Of that, most of that is for agriculture and other concerns, but there is part of that which is dedicated for the environment. But that of course, is just one element of invasive species management. And, I guess the invasive species in this case, of course, is a disease. But nonetheless, it's so there is some dedicated funding for that concern. All right. Restoration. So restoration is a really big blind spot at the federal government funding level. It is a major policy challenge. There are targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework that Australia has. In fact, one of them has been made a priority target for Australia. This is the restoring 30% of degraded lands by 2030. but we don't have a dedicated program yet, and there's no national restoration strategy. But one possibility is that the government may choose to use the nature repair market. Now, I realise I need to communicate to an audience of people some of who know what the nature repair market is and some who don't. So just a very quick primer. This was a market that was legislated in the last term of Parliament. It with the intention of matching landholders who want to undertake biodiversity projects with those who are willing to purchase those biodiversity projects. And we've got a range of, it's meant to be range, obviously, not rage of method. But there's a range of methods currently under development. There's one method that has been already released, but there's a number of them currently under development. So the market is very nascent. It's in its infancy. We're still waiting to see what exactly all the different norms and rules and how it's going to work in practice. Having said that, the first biodiversity project has been registered now under the market. But there are some major policy challenges for this market because what's going to drive demand? The hope is that by the government is they set up essentially a market platform and that private buyers will be the ones driving demand. But it's really not clear what is going to drive their demand at this stage. It's perfectly possible that in the future there will be drivers to their demand, and in fact there is. There are some financial disclosure requirements that affect climate risks. Now it's being legislated. And there's scope within that same legislation to require disclosure of nature-related financial risks. So that could drive demand in the future, but at this stage it's really quite unclear. Originally, there was an attempt to put offsets into the market, and I'll park that for a moment because I'll talk about offsets a little bit later. And that could have driven demand, but there were some concerns around putting offsets in the market before the new laws within the EPBC Act would govern what offsets were going to look like. So there's concern about putting essentially the cart before the horse. Now, my own personal view, for what it's worth, is that not having a clear driver for demand for the market is not necessarily a bad thing whilst we're setting it up. There's some benefit to making mistakes in a smaller market while we're trying to get the rules all sorted out and working as best they should before it gets too big. So, but I'm not sure that there's a problem in the first instance. There's not a lot of pent-up demand waiting to be unleashed. But of course, ultimately, there will need to be demand somewhere. And in particular, we will need to see some cornerstone government procurement into the market. So we need the government to be a purchaser to help drive demand in the first instance, to help build the supplier projects in the market. And that's essentially what happened in the carbon market as well. So, there's precedent for this. Having said that, we don't have any government procurement that's clearly allocated yet. There's maybe some through that Saving Australia's bushland program I mentioned before, but that's over the horizon. It's not yet. So long story short, restoration really hasn't been holistically addressed by the federal government yet. So that's a major policy challenge. All right, so now stepping into states and territories, and I wanted to make a very quick point around environmental offsets first. So for those of you who aren't familiar, environmental offsets are essentially the way that the state and territory jurisdictions try to deal with the fact that they want a development to go ahead, but it's going to destroy particularly valuable biodiversity, or for that matter, it's going to destroy any biodiversity. The basic idea is that if you destroy a certain amount of biodiversity and habitat and so on in one place, then you really need to restore it, or get improvements to other biodiversity in other places. So it's meant to be a zero-sum game. Now, in practice, of course, it's not been that. We haven't seen, and all the analysis, all the research on these programs across the country have shown that they aren't delivering on the promise of compensating properly for the amount of damage that's occurred. And there's different approaches to this, and I won't go for all that now, but suffice to say, this is a major policy challenge, is to get these environmental offset markets at the state level actually functioning more effectively. And One approach to that is in New South Wales, where they want to transition to a nature positive approach to offsets. So that means that instead of just going for a zero-sum game, they want to build in a size of, a reasonable buffer so that they can hand on heart say, well, no, we're going to build back better, as it were. Right, so let's do a little bit of a tour around the country. And again, this is not meant to cover every single land conservation issue or, policy challenge in each of those jurisdictions. It's really just picking up on some of the, the more salient, certainly the ones that come up in my work. No doubt you'll have plenty more to add to the list yourselves, but let me just give you a bit of a flavour of some of the challenges. So New South Wales doesn't have a protection target. They don't have a target for protected areas for conservation. And so that's a big gap in that state, especially since it's nowhere near achieving the 30 by 30 target, the 30% protection target that Australia as a whole is trying to achieve. There is reform of their centrepiece state-based legislation currently underway, and that's a process that's taking some time. There's been a government response to an independent review with this act, and so the various stakeholders in the department and the minister's office are beavering away very heavily to try and come up with solutions to some of the reforms. Their land clearance, though, remains a major concern, and largely the government response to the independent review of the land clearance provisions, as well as the Conservation Act more broadly, really kicked the can down the road. And so the response was to the review was to do another review. And so we're sort of in the midst of that at the moment. And for anyone who follows the issue, there's obviously native forest logging concerns still in New South Wales. Moving along, so to Victoria now, and I'm trying to, I think, go around the country clockwise here. So if you're wondering why I've chosen the order, look, probably the biggest challenge at the moment in Victoria is around the transition of state forests. They've ended native forestry in Victoria, reasonably recently, and there's now a process underway of like, well, what now happens to all those forests, all those forest reserves? What's going to be the land use moving forwards? And unfortunately, there's a real challenge where the current Labor government has stepped away from the idea of, I guess, doing a lot of protection, in particular national parks. They've said there's not going to be any new national parks. Now, there are other types of protected areas that aren't national parks, but that's a real concern that I guess the largest opportunity the state has for doing a major uplift in its protection of nature at this stage looks like the Labor government there wishes to to miss that opportunity. They do have commitments around some national parks in the Central West, which were meant to have progressed by now but haven't. And funding, for anyone who follows the Victorian government budget, is a real challenge now in Victoria. So trying to get an expansion of funding for any new initiatives is a real challenge. Tasmania, obviously native forest logging is a real concern down there as well. That invigorates the environmental movement constantly. We know that the particular forests and ecosystems down there are going to really struggle with climate change. I mean, that's the case across the country, but we have a particular challenge around the mixture of fire and these drying out World Heritage forests that places that have not not properly burnt or haven't burnt at all for living memory now are suddenly actually burning at quite some scale. The Conservation Covenant program there. So conservation covenants are the way of doing permanent protection for nature on privately managed land. So the Conservation Covenant program down there is very limited. There is some limited federal funding to try to kickstart things, but we'll see how far that goes. And as is the case with any smaller jurisdiction, funding is always a challenge. Moving around to South Australia, we have the Biodiversity Act is a new act that has been introduced in South Australia. We haven't had a central unifying environmental, piece of environmental legislation in South Australia, like a lot of other jurisdictions do. That's been introduced to Parliament, and there's a series of potential amendments that will be considered as we come to the upper house. one of my favourite topics. I happen to live in South Australia, so I'm very happy to talk about this ad infinitum at a later point. Um, there's also the challenge of delivering what I say large-scale restoration. There's a huge amount of destruction of nature in South Australia. Sometimes people ask, like, well, why don't you do native forestry in South Australia anymore? You stopped that a long time ago. Well, if I was being cynical, I'd say that's because we'd cut most of it down already, so there wasn't a sustainable industry anymore. So we've got a particular challenge around how do we do large scale restoration when protection is not as available for large parts of the agricultural landscape. And again, funding, is a real challenge for one of these smaller financially capable jurisdictions. Um, and I've said here, the need to develop leverage funding models. So across a lot of other jurisdictions, governments are doing cornerstone funding to try to then leverage funding from, international philanthropic foundations and other sources of funding. The idea that they put some money in to leverage additional money from partners. Well, we don't have a mechanism for that here in South Australia. And so really there's a strong need to develop those sorts of models here. Moving around again to WA, anyone from WA knows that the mining and energy sector over there has a preponderance within the politics there and on policy matters, and we see that again and again when it comes to any conflicts between these industries and nature. And one classic example is the removal of climate considerations from their Environment Protection Agency just in the last term of the Cook government there. So the argument being that was something that really was going to be considered within federal legislation instead. Funnily enough, of course, with the Northwest Shelf decision, we know that doesn't, of course, take into account climate considerations. In any case, their centrepiece program for nature conservation on land and sea, was this plan called Plan for Our Parks. And that's delivered 6.5 million hectares of protection. So it has made a serious uplift, delivered a serious uplift there. But then the question, of course, is, well, what's next? The job hasn't been done. That's a great uplift, but the job hasn't been done. So there's opportunities for investment in conservation covenants. So again, that's protection on privately managed land for conservation, because there's very little investment in WA into conservation covenants. But we have particular barriers in what's called the pastoral estate. So this is the larger proportion of WA where there are large scale, predominantly agricultural operations, and so they're done through leases. The land ownership is done through leases from the government over long time periods rather than freehold ownership. And so at the moment, these conservation covenants can't exist within the pastoral estate because it's contrary to the legislation that governs that area. So that's a real barrier and a challenge, especially, some of ALCA's members operate, properties in the pastoral estate in WA, and they can't avail themselves of this formal protection measure. And again, they aren't using leverage funding models that a lot of the other states are using as well. So there's a missed opportunity there, I guess. They're also got their own forestry transition happening, native forestry transition happening down in the southwest of the state. And then to the Northern Territory, we know that land clearance is increasing, especially in the savannas. Lots of challenges around invasive species from exotic pasture, so offal, gamba, and the interactions between that and fire. Water usage certainly has, made the headlines in recent years, especially, drawing upon rivers and the use of that water for cotton. They don't have a conservation covenant program at all. And again, as with any, smaller financially capable jurisdiction, funding remains a perennial challenge. In Queensland, they have a target that's obviously not as ambitious as the national target, but nonetheless they do have a protected area target, and they've got a long way to go to get there. So, and the challenge is how are they going to deliver that, especially when we see funding for some of the programs that would contribute is subsiding and needs to be reinvigorated. The native forest logging and land clearance remains a challenge up there. Environmental offsets are a particular challenge in Queensland, where essentially it's very hard for the fund that is built up from developers who have paid into a fund rather than to deliver an offset themselves. They pay into a fund, and the government then needs to spend that money from the fund to get the the uplift in the environment to compensate for the destruction elsewhere. That is posing a particular challenge in Queensland because of, I guess, the constraints on how that fund can be spent, and also just being able to access the appropriate land to deliver, that compensation. It's also the place in the country where tensions between renewable energy land use and the environment, and for that matter, other land use as well, is the most acute. We have examples where, wind farms are being built in public protected areas, so parks and things, which are, highly problematic. And it's also the only jurisdiction to levy land tax on its conservation covenants on its nature refuges. So that's I guess, maybe a bit of a niche issue, niche challenge, but something that's close to my heart to see if we can resolve. And then to ACT, for those of you who thought that I might have missed it, well, look, I'm sure there's plenty of other local level issues in ACT that I'm not aware of, but I do know that they don't have a conservation covenant program, and that fits within the ambit of things that I tend to think about quite commonly. So that's another major policy challenge. So now moving across to advocacy, and I realise I've probably over-talked, so I'll try to be quick. Look, the reason I mention advocacy here is because of that troika, that tripartite diagram I described before around you need a practical solution, you need a political solution, and you also need effective advocacy. Now, broadly speaking, we often think about advocacy in two parts. There's the inside track, which is talking to the decision makers or those who are influencers, or the person from the department who I might call a pen holder, who might write, the recommendations to the minister, right? So that's the inside track. And then campaigning is the broader public, campaign that you might see, the likes of, say, the Australian Conservation Foundation or the Wilderness Society, putting up billboards and ads in your social media feeds and so on. But ultimately, advocacy is about trying to persuade the decision to make or not to make a decision. But as I say here, it's not just about going straight for the decision maker, although that's important. It's also about, who will be other people and organisations and influencers who really need to be brought on board to, at the very least, accept the decision, even if they might not fully support it. So assuming that you have an effective policy solution, and you're engaging in advocacy, you really need to think about, well, who are your audiences? Are you actually speaking to them yourself? And as someone who was on the receiving end of a huge number of meetings in Parliament, various advocates trying to, push their particular message, they often wouldn't put it in terms of, well, why was, my MP that I was working for, why would she want to adopt this decision? Like, they were talking about why it was important to them, but not talking about why it was important to the person they were trying to convince. So you really do need to put yourselves in the shoes of the decision maker, and some of that is often just as simple as, are they actually the person who can make this decision? I mean, often we would get advocates, say, around a particular international conflict, trying to talk to us about what, that we really need to stop a war in a particular location, or we need to help out a particular group of people. And, it's very easy to be sympathetic to people in the circumstances, but, an independent federal MP on the crossbench really has exceptionally little power to do anything about a conflict far, far away. So, we always have to frame things in terms of, well, are these actually the people who can actually make the decision? And so, again, that takeaway is good policy is good politics. So I'm now, I guess, at the very end where I'm, plugging a few things for ALCA. I've been told I need to. I don't always feel comfortable plugging things, but look, I think it's important that it's important and useful that you know about these, just in case you want to avail yourself of the opportunities. We are going to be running a couple of master classes. Apparently, there's 10 spots left, and the registration's closed today. So do feel free to register for them if you are interested. But even more excitingly, really just to raise the fact that ALCA has an annual conference. This year it is in Cairns at a very nice time of the year in early October. And we have 4 days of workshops and events and field trips and plenaries and all sorts. And it really is a big occasion. Last time in Sydney we had more than 400 delegates. So it really is a high quality event. And the reason I can say that is because I'm not the one who does most of the organising, so I can attest to the quality that others provide. And lastly, that apparently if you book before 30th of June, there are early bird tickets, and apparently a chance to win a reef trip, which is interesting. So I wonder whether I can register or not. So without any further ado, I think we jump into questions. So for those who've been here the entire time, thank you so much for bearing with us for this long.